How Russia became the biggest country. It wouldn't be a revelation to anyone if I said that Russia is a big country. Only its European part accounts for 2/5 of the continent. This leads to interesting observations. For example, here's the results of a poll from the TLDR News EU YouTube channel. 400,000 people voted on what countries they considered to be Eastern or Western European. This map doesn't even include Russia, and it's easy to see why. If you include it, Eastern Europe is going to be, well, like just Russia. Then the entire point of this simplistic East-West divide just doesn't make any sense. But this video is not about the European part of Russia. It surely is more significant politically and economically, but it's not something we can cover in a single video like this. And on top of that, in terms of area, it's just a quarter of what makes Russia by far the biggest country. The rest is in Asia. But how did all of this land end up inside of the same border? For starters, this area is not necessarily the best to live in. It's cold, with basically everyone here seeing more ice and snow than liquid water during the course of the year. The soil is barely usable for agriculture. See all this yellow? It's labeled as non-agricultural land. The red parts are in permafrost, so they aren't any better. If that wasn't enough, after you cross the Ural Mountains, it's nothing but plains for thousands of kilometers. And plains aren't easy to defend if your capital is way over there, and your enemies are, say, coming from over here. The natural resources, however, are something really worth fighting for. Except when this abundance of oil, gas, and other stuff was found there, it was already under Russia's control, so it was just a nice bonus. But the worthlessness of North Asia didn't stop 16th century Russians. They didn't even know what land features were there, let alone natural resources. They only knew that it's where the Mongols came from. But before the Russians could start exploring beyond the Ural Mountains, they first had to assert dominance in Europe. Muscovy's primary goal back then was to reach the highly fertile lands in the south and unite, or rather to rule over, the nations of the former Kievan Rus, whether they wanted it or not. The Grand Duchy of Muscovy had the upper hand there, as it was the second country after the Novgorod Republic to acquire full independence from the Golden Horde in 1471. That very year, Novgorod lost a war against Moscow, and 7 years later, the Republic was under the full control of Muscovy. After consolidating power in the northeast of Europe, the Russians didn't like the idea of fighting against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which occupied the west of the former Kievan Rus' territories. Instead, they shifted their focus to the southeast, which was a stepping stone to Asia. In the mid-16th century, the Russians focused on conquering the Khanate of Kazan. This land was initially populated by multiple ethnicities, of which East Slavs were only a small part, so the Russians were not welcome. It probably didn't help that these people adopted Islam in the 10th century, and then were occupied by the Mongols for almost 200 years. Nonetheless, the Russians were more powerful, so after at least 10 sieges, the Khanate fell in 1552. After that, the Russians started doing their regular stuff, erasing the culture, scattering the population across their territory, and killing the rebels until the area was Russianized enough in 1556. During the same time, the Khanate of Astrakhan was growing more and more cooperative with Russia. But then its Khan allied with the Crimeans and the Nogias to the south. Russia reacted by sending 30,000 troops against him. So in 1556, the Khanate of Astrakhan was gone. The path to Asia was now as open as it could be. Despite that, the Russians weren't too eager to explore Asia. They had enough problems with Europe already. However, in 1580 this changed because of Yermak Timofeyevich, who just kinda decided to go on a conquest with only 540 troops. His exact motives are unclear, but most probably he just wanted a battle victory to appease Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of Russia. Quite surprisingly, that's exactly what he did. This is how the Khanate of Sibir looked like in 1580. After 2 years, Yermak's forces lost 107 men and gained control over the capital, Kashlik. Seems like a good trade-off. A couple years later, Yermak had to flee because the estimated 800 reinforcements were not enough to sustain control over the rebellious locals, and destroyed Kashlik on his way home. In the 1590s, the Russians returned with more forces, only to see a devastated Khanate of Sibir that failed to recover. This Khanate was not the only remnant of the Mongol Empire in such a bad state. In fact, as the Russians advanced further eastward, they did not encounter any civilizations that were more advanced than indigenous tribes. It all makes sense if you look at this map. Green color marks land that's agriculturally viable. It is surrounded by permafrost in the north and deserted wastelands in the south. As you go from south to north, the cold strikes harder every night, and the desert doesn't end. On top of that, you don't know whether this green stripe exists there at all. So, after questioning your life choices, you go home and you never come back. But if you go into Asia from Europe, it makes a lot more sense. You could also go the opposite way. But this wheat belt ends where modern-day China begins. Because of this, there were only two nations which managed to get hold of this entire region: the Russians and the Mongols. All of this means that the Russians basically had a monopoly over the entirety of North Asia. And not only that, they also had a use for all this land. You see, all this territory wasn't considered useless in every way back in the 16th century. There was one valuable resource here. This resource is fur. It generated quite a lot of revenue for the Russians, and that's why they were incentivized to continue exploring the region after conquering the Khanate of Sibir in 1598. The expansion of this fur empire is very similar to what happened in the Americas when the Europeans got there. In the early 17th century, they started building towns and outposts in major strategic locations to establish their rule over the indigenous peoples and collect fur tribute. The Nenets and Khanty were the first to fall under the colonizers' rule. Then the Yakut, Koryak, Kamchadal, and Chukchi were also enslaved. Those who refused to obey were shot, hanged, or experienced some other way of demise. Those who did obey still had a solid 80% chance to die of smallpox that the Russians brought there. As of now, some of these nations are only represented by a couple thousand people who mostly live in villages and help the Russians advertise themselves as a diverse nation that would never do anything like what the Europeans did in the Americas and Africa. Anyway, by the mid-17th century, the Russians already reached the Pacific Ocean. They truly mastered the art of conquering indigenous tribes, and only stopped at the Chinese border where they saw fortifications and cannons. This is roughly how much territory Russia had in 1639. After that, it focused on expanding into Europe, where the practices previously used in Siberia were scaled up to suppress the far more populous peoples that inhabited what now is Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. This time, however, it wasn't really about Kievan Rus. After centuries of consistent European influence, there was no Kiev anymore, only Kyiv. However, it looks like the Russians still don't understand this. So the Muscovites were focused on making everyone forget that they were not the centerpiece of the Rus, and their presence in Siberia was only maintained to keep the indigenous tribes under control. One exception to this is a conflict with China about the status of these territories. But in 1689, the Russians backed down, setting this red line in the north as the border until the mid-19th century. However, keeping these tribes under control is just a euphemism for what was actually happening. In western and central Siberia, the colonizers settled in newly built towns, so that the indigenous tribes would be assimilated into an ethnic Russian majority. The inflow wasn't big, but it was consistent. Some moved here to get rich by selling fur, some to get lost and avoid persecution in the European part of the empire, and some were forcefully transported to Siberia because they failed to avoid persecution and now had to spend the rest of their life working as a slave. The easternmost parts of Russia, especially the Kamchatka Peninsula, were the stage for multiple uprisings that were violently quelled. The Atelmans, for example, had 80% of their population wiped out during the second half of the 18th century, with only 3,000 of them surviving to date. Overall, at least 12 nations were exterminated, and the indigenous population of the region decreased from 150,000 to just 10,000 between the 1740s and the 1850s. Another way of keeping the people of the region down was imposing crushing tributes, also known as yasak, which was exclusive to Siberia and barely allowed the population to survive. It negated any possibility of economic development and consolidation of power. This meant that the amount of infrastructure there was minimal, only what could be built with slave and prison labor, and it only served to transport goods to and from the Moscow region. A prime example of this is the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was opened in 1904 and then expanded in the times of the Soviet Union. At its peak in the early 1900s, the Russian Empire also controlled Central Asia almost entirely, bordering the territories of modern-day Iran and Afghanistan. The reasons for invading these territories, apart from economic ones, were different from why the Russians expanded into Siberia. In 1718, they started expanding into the Kazakh territories, seeking for a natural barrier. After all, if they didn't conquer this land, some other great empire would do this, and then it would be free to invade Russia's vast and hard-to-defend West Siberian plain. Another reason worth mentioning is khanates that weren't nearly as powerful as Russia, but still launched raids and captured Russians as slaves. Even the British were highly supportive of Russia because of this. During this expansion into Central Asia, the Russians established their first colony all the way into Alaska in 1784. 10 years later, Orthodox missionaries started evangelizing the Native Americans, whose descendants continue to maintain the religion even now. However, the French colonizers and the U.S. had their influence in the region growing a lot faster. So, after almost a century, Alaska was sold to the United States in 1867, largely because the region was not worth defending from Moscow's perspective. The last push of Russian expansion started in the 1840s, when this border dispute with China resurfaced. After the Opium War, China was especially weak, and after a couple decades of stability, Russia was especially strong. So it just sent troops and settlers into the territory, and China basically did nothing to defend itself. In 1860, all these colored regions belonged to Russia. This last wave of expansion in the 19th century was allowed by a period of relative peace with the European neighbors. It started after Napoleon was defeated in 1812. His invasion demonstrates one of the key advantages of Russia's vast territorial possessions. It is simply impossible to defeat such an empire in just one war. Napoleon's army was not self-sufficient, just like any of that period, which means that it had to rely on the occupied territories for resources. But there was a problem. Even the European territories of Russia were so sparsely populated that there was almost nobody to get these resources from. Despite that, Napoleon reached Moscow in September, hoping that Alexander would offer a peace treaty and fulfill his demands. But there was a problem. Most houses in Moscow were empty. The Russians just moved east from the capital, preparing to attack the exhausted French army. A similar scenario took place in World War II, when the Russians retreated several times to exhaust the Germans and gain strategic advantage. But there was a problem. This strategy only works in case there is an invader that wants to conquer the entirety of the empire, or force its czar to sign some sort of an unfavorable treaty. Here lies one of the reasons why Russia is so afraid of separatism. The first major wave of separatism started in 1917 with Finland, which got its independence approved in December, when the civil war in Russia was in full swing. Other nations, however, weren't nearly as lucky. Moscow did everything to keep them inside what would soon be known as the Soviet Union. In Central Asia, Muslims from Central Asia were drafted for army service in World War I a lot more than those who lived closer to Moscow. Seeing the central government in its weakened state, they started a movement for independence, which was brutally crushed, leaving 150,000 slaughtered after years of pogroms and ethnic cleansing. In the Arctic, the Tungus Republic tried to declare independence in 1924, after being subjected to systemic ethnic cleansing. The Russians responded with force, then lured the republic into a ceasefire with fake autonomy promises, and then executed the movement's leadership. Almost the same happened in Yakutia in 1927. An attempt to form a democratic confederation was crushed with a fake autonomy deal. In 1933, the Khanty people started a revolt against the Soviet collectivization policies. The Red Army responded by burning dozens of villages and killing their inhabitants. After that, anyone who took part in celebration of the Khanty culture was subject to 10 years of imprisonment. The list goes on and on and on. I haven't even started talking about Europe, where the Russians were far more violent. The list is so unbearably long that just briefly mentioning the cause and the results of each suppressed movement will probably take more time than everything else in this video. However, a readable version was compiled by the Ukrainian journalist Maxim Eristavy in September last year. If you want to read it, you can find it in the description. But why couldn't Russia just leave these nations be? They still wouldn't have many options other than to continue trade with Russia, and after a period of independence it would arguably be better, even economically, to have all these nations working together instead of one exploiting the others. After all, that's what Spain did, and some other European colonial empires too. The answer lies in the fact that it's not really possible to convince a group of people as large and as influential as the population of Moscow to work for the long term, with the decentralization paying off only after at least a couple decades. It is already in our history books. After the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a brief period of liberalization in Russia. 14 countries were granted independence, and reforms were proposed to grant more autonomy to indigenous peoples, mostly in Asia. But as these reforms started rolling in, millions of Russians found themselves in poverty. Nationalists and communists started protesting against reforms, which resulted in President Yeltsin's consolidation of power and continuation of war on separatism, starting from 1994 in Chechnya. The thing is, the Russian economy is still basically that of a land empire. The actions in Moscow dictate what comes next in other regions, and the disproportionate wealth of the capital severely depends on exploitation of the provinces. So, when the provinces break free from exploitation, the capital suffers. When the capital suffers, nationalist protests arise. And when the nationalists in Moscow are unhappy, what comes next is always a brutal crackdown on the minorities. But as we have seen, not only minorities inside of Russia are in danger. Even declaring independence is not enough to avoid Russian imperialism, and Ukraine is just one of the many targets of the empire.